Hola a todos, soy Javier Poveda y esto es De Bien TV, el canal donde te lo vas a pasar de bien mientras aprendes geografía, historia del arte y un poco de economía y empresariales. Este vídeo es para cuarto de sección CEIPSO el Encinar de Torrelodones. In this video we are going to start the Unit 8, the Second World War. This is going to be probably the longest video in this channel, so let's start. Already, here we are with our presentation about the Second World War, and the first part is properly the main points of the Second World War. In a second part, we will study the consequences of this conflict. So, the Second World War was a conflict, a military conflict, the greatest conflict in history, which took place between 1939 and 1945, the 1st of September and the 15th of August of 1945. And it involved almost all countries in the world. Here you have the blue ones, the blue territories, the Axis countries, and the green ones, the Allies. So, why did this war take place? Because of the following: the nationalist discontent at the end of the First World War, because mainly both Germany and Italy wanted more territories than the ones they had. Germany wanted to recover the territories that they had lost after the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the World War I, and Italy wanted the territories that weren't given to her and the ones that they were promised, and they were the reason why Italy joined the Allies in the First World War. Then the economic protectionism, because of the Great Depression of the 1930s, which we had already studied. All these governments adopted these protectionist policies to protect their industry and their economy, and most of these measures were directed to reinforce their own industry, particularly the rearmament industry. Then the expansionist policies, we have talked about them already, the first point, and the appeasement policies that were held by the countries that will be the allies, okay, especially Great Britain and France. This means that, well, this means política de apaciguamiento en castellano. This means that both Germany and both Great Britain and France gave concessions to the Germans and the Italians, mostly to the Germans, because they thought that Hitler will become tired of asking for territories. But this never happened, because Hitler, since Great Britain and France let him ask for more and more and more, so he kept asking for more and more territories and for more revocations of the articles of the Treaty of Versailles. The aim was to maintain peace, but sometimes you have to stop. These were the territories that both Germany and Italy wanted for them, okay? The ones that they already lost in the World War I, and most of these, the coast of the Adriatic Sea, and that weren't given to Italy, despite they were promised to her. So, this expansionist policy that these countries conducted was like this. The Japanese occupied Manchuria, which is the north of China, in 1931, and between 1933 and 1938, the north of China, looking for raw materials, which led to a war against China. Italy invaded Abyssinia, which is today's Ethiopia, in 1935, and later in 1939 they conquered Albania. And the most important one, the German expansionist policy, was like this. They reincorporated the Saar, El Sarre, which is a little small region in the west, in 1935 after a plebiscite. This region was ruled under the protection of the Society of the League of Nations. In 1936, they remilitarized the Rhineland, which was forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles, and in 1938 the Anschluss happened. Anschluss means union, which is the annexation of Austria by Germany. Later, the Sudetenland was annexed, which is an area with a majority of German population in the Czech Republic, after the Munich Conference, which took place in 1938 with the meeting of the leaders of the four main powers. But after that, 1 year later, in 1939, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, well, the rest of the Czech Republic, the Czech part of Czechoslovakia, which became the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. And this again broke the agreement made at Munich. As you can see, the policy of appeasement didn't work at all. So this is a map of the Japanese expansion. This is the Manchukuo, the north of China. This is the Italian Empire in 1939 with Albania and Ethiopia. And these are the changes, the territorial changes that affected Germany during these years. The Saar, the Rhineland, the Anschluss, the Sudetenland, and the rest of the Czech part of Czechoslovakia. This is a picture of the Conference of Munich with the four leaders, and here we have the two sides of the war. First we have the Axis, el eje. It started in 1936 with an alliance of Germany between Germany and Italy. Then the Anti-Comintern Pact in the same year, 1936, with Japan, to protect themselves, between Germany and Japan, to protect themselves against the USSR, which Italy joined the year later. Then this alliance was known as the Axis, because it's the Axis, the Berlin-Rome-Tokyo Axis, Roberto, in 1940. Then other countries will join the Axis during the war, mostly in 1940 and 1941, Finland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and some others sent troops or supplies, for example, Spain. And the last part of this is the surprising pact of non-aggression between the USSR and the Nazi Germany in 1939, just 15 days before the start of the war, which was very shocking to the rest of the world, since they were both enemies. Because Hitler was an anti-communist and Stalin was not stupid. And they agreed to not attack each other and to divide Poland between themselves when the war broke out. Then we have the Allies, mainly Great Britain and France, and this happened in 1939 after the abandonment of the appeasement policy. Finally, they abandoned this policy and they signed this mutual support pact with France. Great Britain and France signed this. And after the threats from Germany to Poland, because they wanted to annex Danzig, which is a city that separated both parts of Germany, well, they guaranteed the independence of Poland, and that's the reason why the war started. So, well, here's some pictures of the signing of these agreements. I'm not going to spend time here. And finally, the war started on the 1st of September 1939 at 4:45 in the morning, when Germany invaded Poland, so Great Britain and France declared war against Germany. The USSR also invaded Poland 15 days after the German invasion, and they occupied the eastern part of the country. Meanwhile, the Germans occupied the west. This was the secret articles of the non-aggression pact that they had signed between each other. Later, well, in 1941, the United States will join the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the USSR, the last major power, will join the war also in 1941 after the German invasion of their territory. So this is some maps about the Polish campaign. They defeated the Polish very easily. And this is how the map of Europe looked like in December of 1939. They were already at war. This was the territory occupied by Germany, and Germany and Great Britain was at war with Great Britain and France. But they didn't fight a lot here in the Western Front because the French were they were scared, to be honest. So the first part of the war are the Axis offensives. This in the first years of the war, since 1939 to 1942, the Axis were winning. Why this did happen? Because the Germans used the so-called blitzkrieg or lightning war or guerra relámpago, which means rapid successive attacks on the enemy front. First, a combination of three types of attacks. First, the air attacks, here with the bombers, and they, well, mostly with the Stukas. These are Stukas, they are closer interdiction bombers, which destroyed most of the defenses and the air force of the enemy. Later, land attacks, first by the panzers, the tank divisions, which penetrated very fast into the enemy territory. And lastly, the infantry took over the remaining defenses that were still up. And this tactic worked really well. This is a diagram showing this, a video of the siren of these Stukas, and they applied this tactic, the Germans, in Poland and later in the successive countries they were invading. Denmark and Norway first in the north, and later with the French campaign or the West campaign, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg and France. And they defeated France very easily, we will see that later. After that, the most important battle was the Battle of Britain in 1940. Well, it lasted 2 years more, but the most important battles were in this year, because Hitler wanted to defeat the Royal Air Force, the British Royal Air Force, after France was defeated, because they wanted to invade Great Britain. But there was the British fleet, which wouldn't allow that, so they needed the air superiority. But the British managed to hold the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, so they were defeated. Later, in Southern Europe, once the Italians had joined the war, which they did right before the defeat of France, the Germans conquered Greece and Yugoslavia because they were preparing the invasion of the Soviet Union, so they wanted to keep their back secure. And also the Axis was joined by these countries we have already talked about: Hungary, Romania, Slovakia and Bulgaria. So all Southern Europe was now in the Axis. That year, in June, Hitler invaded the USSR, which was called the Operation Barbarossa or Barbarroja. And this attack broke this non-aggression pact that they have signed back in 1939. And Hitler wanted to, what is called the 11th round, the vital space, el espacio vital, for the Germans. They wanted also the raw materials from the USSR, mostly the wheat from Ukraine and the petroleum from the Caucasus. So Stalin joined the Allies, and the Soviet had to retreat, but applying this scorched earth policy, which means the destruction of anything that the enemy could use. That means the crops, so the food, the livestock, the industry and the transport infrastructure, the bridges, the roads or whatever that the Germans could use in their own benefit. After that, the Germans kept advancing, and they reached the outskirts of Leningrad, which held a siege of 3 years, and the outskirts of Moscow, and in the south they reached the Caucasus. But after that they had to stop. We will see why. Some maps: the invasion of Norway and Denmark. This is the invasion of France, which was they were genius, the military, the German military, because the French had built this line of fortifications in in the years previous to the war. So the Germans, they concentrated most of these Panzer divisions here, and they broke the front here in the area of Sedan and reached the coast and circled most of the French and British army, who had already advanced into Belgium to protect them, because the Germans also attacked the Netherlands and Belgium. So this is what happened. Pim, pam, boom, and they had to evacuate here in Dunkirk. After that, they advanced into France, and when the front line was more or less here and the Italians had already joined the war, the French asked for an armistice, which they did. We will see here. Well, this is not Oslo, this is Rotterdam in Netherlands. These are the Germans parading in Paris, Pim. This is Hitler in a tourist visit to Paris. And in this video you have the signing of the armistice of Compiègne. This armistice was signed in the same train wagon and in the same forest, the forest of Compiègne, in which the armistice of the World War I was signed back in 1918. So Hitler wanted to pay back the humiliation that the Germans had suffered in the World War I. So what happened? The Germans occupied most of North and West France, and independent government was established in the southern part of France, led by Philippe Pétain, which was a philo-fascist government. And this was called the France of Vichy, because this is where this was the capital of this new state. This is the Battle of Britain. The British had the help of the radar, which warned them about the taking off of the German planes. This was a very important weapon that led them to the victory in this battle. These are the Supermarine Spitfire, a British fighter, Messerschmitt Bf 109, the best fighter in the war, undoubtedly, a German bomber, Heinkel 111 or 111, and these are the bombings in London. Later, the campaign of the Balkans, they took over all of this area with the help of their new allies, and the paratrooper attack on Crete. And these are the Germans in Athens. So before the invasion of the USSR, before the Operation Barbarossa, this is how the European map looked like. Great Britain was alone in the war, and the Germans and their allies, Italy and the Central European allies, controlled most of the continent. And after that, the Operation Barbarossa broke out, and the Germans rapidly advanced into the Soviet territory. As you can see here, they reached Leningrad here, the outskirts of Moscow here, and they advanced also from in the south. Well, later in winter, winter was a very big problem to the Germans, because they weren't used to fighting these climate conditions, while the USSR were. So they could force the Germans back a little bit, but in the summer, in the year after, in 1942, on the summer, the Germans started again their advance, and mostly in the southern part of the Soviet Union, in the Caucasus. And this is the best advance that the Germans could do, where they reached Stalingrad, which is this city here in the Volga River. And this was the turning point of the war. Well, some pictures, tanks, dead Soviets, the Germans advancing in the winter in Russia, the scorchers policy. And meanwhile, in Africa, this was another theater of the war. The Italians attacked the British protectorate of Egypt from Libya. Remember the colonies that we studied in the imperialism unit. But the Italians were useless, and the Germans had to help them, and they sent the Africa Corps, which was an expeditionary force led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, probably the best German military of the Wehrmacht. And why did they invade Egypt? Because they wanted to take control of the Suez Canal. because the British used the Suez Canal to bring troops and supplies from their empire, mostly from India. And in the in the year 1941, the Japanese, after the French defeat, they invaded the French colonies in Indochina and began their expansion in the Pacific. So that the United States, which were very concerned about this, and they had the Philippines, they may announce an embargo on steel and petroleum, so the Japanese decided to attack before the United States would attack them. So they performed a surprise attack on the naval base of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii in the 7th of December of 1941. So the last major power joined the war in the side of the Allies, the United States. These are some maps of the Africa's offensives. I'm not going to stop here. This is some pictures of the German tanks in the desert. This is Erwin Rommel, very handsome, by the way. And this is the Japanese Empire. And this is the attack on Pearl Harbor and the later expansion of the Japanese. Well, this is a Japanese map, and these are some pictures of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese pilots, and the torpedo bombers that the Japanese used in this attack, and that they will, the ones they used the rest of the war. This is a part of the movie of Pearl Harbor, which is very interesting, and more maps of the Japanese attacks on mostly on the Philippines, which was a United States territory. And in the year 1942, the war turned around, and the Allies started with their victories. First, the war in Africa ended because the collaboration of the British and the Americans. The Americans landed in the north of Africa, which was called the Operation Torch, so they made a sandwich. From the west, from the east, the British, from the west, the Americans. So, and mostly after the Battle of El Alamein, which was the turning point in the war in Africa in November 1942. So, after that, they went towards Tunisia and they expelled the Axis from Africa. Later, they will attack Italy from these positions. Here, maps and pictures and maps. And this is M3 Lee, which is a very ugly tank, but it was useful. Then next main battles, the Battle of the Atlantic, since 1942-1943, the Germans, since they had no power against the powerful British and now American Navy, they made some large-scale use of the submarines, which they called U-8. Why? To sink the Allied merchants that were supplying the British. And it was successful, but the Allies started to protect them with convoys. Then the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942-1943. The German forces occupied the city, but the Soviet army managed to circle them with a clamp attack. I don't know if you can say clamp attack, but they encircled them, and this was the first major defeat of the Germans since the complete army, the 6th Army of the Germans, had to surrender. And this was the beginning of the retreat from the USSR. Then, in 1943, the Allied troops landed in Italy, first in Sicily and later in the Italian peninsula, and they advanced from Italy to the north, and this caused the demission of Mussolini in 1943 and his execution in 1945. Mussolini was taken into prison, but the Germans rescued him, and but he was later, at the end of the war, he was caught by the partisans and executed instantly in 1945. This U-8s, sinking of ships, the American convoys, and the Battle of Stalingrad. Okay, the Germans occupied the west bank of the Volga River, and the Soviets the eastern part, and they managed to defend the city at the cost of many lives. These are some pictures of Stalingrad. As you can see, boom, they fought house after house. This is a very good movie, very propagandistic movie, but it's an entertaining movie. Enemy at the Gates, Enemigo a las Puertas, está en el Netflix, por favor verla, buenísima. And this is how Stalingrad looked like after the battle. After that, the retreat of the Germans and the Soviet counterattack. Well, before this is von Paulus, who was the commander of the 6th German Army, and this was the first time a German field marshal, surrendered instead of shooting himself, because he was smart. And now the Soviet counterattack, and meanwhile the Allies landed in Sicily and later in the Italian peninsula and started their way north. Here are some pictures of the Italian campaign, and this is Mussolini and his lover Clara Petacci and a couple of leaders, of fascist leaders, hanged in a petrol station in an oil station in Milan in 1945. And later we have the Conference of Tehran. Tehran is the capital of Iran in 1943. Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin, they agreed to open a new front in France, which later will be the landings of Normandy, which took place on the 6th of June of 1944. North American, British and Canadians landed in 4 beaches of Normandy under the command of Dwight Eisenhower, which was commander-in-chief of the Allied force. And this was a complete success, and they managed to liberate first Paris, well, the Spanish liberated Paris, and later the rest of France. So the Germans were in a position in which they had to fight in 3 fronts: the Western Front in France, the Southern Front in Italy, and the Eastern Front in the Soviet Union. The Soviets, well, both the 3 fronts advanced. The Allied were unstoppable, and the Soviets regained Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and in May 1945, the 2nd of May, the Soviet entered Berlin, and so Hitler shot himself to avoid being captured, and Germany surrendered on the 8th of May, which is the victory day in Europe. Here we have Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill, the Normandy landings here, and this is what happened. Boom, 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 and well, the paratroopers also, if you have played Call of Duty, you will be familiar with these pictures. This is the disembark in Omaha Beach. This is a very good video of Saving Private Ryan, a very good movie. And this is the Omaha Beach after the landing, with all the Allied boats and disembarking all the supplies. And this is the advance of the Allies in the north of France, the liberation of Paris with la Brigada 9 de la 4ª División acorazada de los franceses del General de Klerk, which were the first. They were Republican exiles, and they were the first to enter Paris. Here they are parading in Paris after the liberation, and later they pushed toward Germany. Okay, here in the Rhine River, and also they liberated Belgium. In the meantime, the Soviets kept pushing in the west, and they made a lot of advances in 2 years, like this. Well, more pictures like this, and later this. Then they even entered the German territory here, and they liberated all the south of part of Europe. So this is the situation at the beginning of 1945. The West Front, the French Front, the Italian Front, and the Soviet Front. And later, this is the final advances in Germany. This is the situation when Germany signed the surrender. Okay, just a few areas were controlled by the Wehrmacht. And this is how the German cities looked like after the Allied bombings. the last public appearance of Hitler, when he was saluting the last soldiers that they could use. A ver, look at their age. I think they are 12 or 13 or 14, I don't know, more or less years old. They were very young. And this is the Reichstag, and another good movie, Downfall, El Hundimiento, which tells us about the last days of Hitler. This very iconic photo with the Soviet flag raising over the Reichstag, and finally the end of the war, which took place in the Pacific. In the Pacific War between the Japanese and the Americans, after the Battle of the Coral Sea and mostly the Battle of Midway in 1942, Battle of Midway was a very important defeat of the Japanese, and it was also the start of the retreat of the Japanese. They were defeated and they started losing control of many of the Pacific islands they have occupied before. And the most important battles are the Battle on Guadalcanal, 1942-1943, later the Battle of the Philippine Sea, next to the Philippine Islands. And with this, in this battle, the North Americans destroyed most of the most important ships, mainly the aircraft carriers of the Japanese, and so the war was already mostly over. The Americans reached the metropolitan Japanese territory in Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and the war finally ended with the nuclear bombing authorized by the new president of the United States, Harry Truman, because Roosevelt had died and Harry Truman was the vice president. The dropping of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima, August the 6th, and Nagasaki, 9th of August, and after that the Japanese surrendered on the 15th of August. So the Second World War ended. More maps. Here are you have the American operations. This is the Battle of the Coral Sea, Battle of Midway here, and some pictures of both forces and more pictures. And these little Pacific islands were very important because you could build these airports or military air bases, so the range of your planes was could go further. And the aircraft carriers were also very important, and battles, boom, 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 boom. This is a scene from Midway, a movie I have not seen, but the scene is very emotional. And here you have the Japanese dominion over the Pacific, and the Battle of Guadalcanal, here, The Thin Red Line, another movie. I didn't like this movie, but the video is interesting. More battles in the Pacific, the operations in the Philippines and Indonesia. This is General Douglas MacArthur, which was the commander-in-chief of the Allied forces in the Pacific. He was a very good guy, estaba de la olla, pero por eso me cae bien. And finally, these are the last territories that the Japanese held. And here you have Iwo Jima here and Okinawa here, which are part of the mainland. And here the bombing of the metropolitan Japan started, and the Americans took revenge very drastically. This is Iwo Jima, this iconic photo of the raising the flag on Iwo Jima. The Japanese kamikazes, as you know, they committed suicide by crashing their planes directly on the American ships. And for example, like this, or like this. And this is how the Japanese cities look like after the American bombings. Well, another video of the Japanese kamikazes. This is the bombing of Tokyo. The Americans used these very good bombers, the Boeing B-29 Super Fortress, which were very efficient bombers. The two nuclear bombs, Fat Man and Little Boy, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the pilots of the B-29 that dropped the bomb in Hiroshima in the plane Enola Gay, and both the atomic bombings on, remember, 6th and 9th of August respectively, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is Hiroshima, and this is also Hiroshima. As you can see, the atomic bombs were very efficient. And this is how the city ended up. As you can see, remember this building. And this is Nagasaki, totally destroyed. And this is, after that, the surrender of the Japanese, which was a speech given by the Emperor Hirohito on 15th August. This was the first time that most of the Japanese subjects listened to their emperor. And this is the signing of the surrender in the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. And, well, more pictures. This is Douglas MacArthur and Emperor of Japan Hirohito. And that's the end. Remember this building from Hiroshima? This is the one building that remained undestroyed after the nuclear bombing. And the Japanese, they preserved this building, and this is now how Hiroshima looks like nowadays. And that's it. Pues ya está, nos hemos quitado 35-36 minutos, no está nada mal para ser uno de la presentación más larga que he hecho en mi vida. Bueno, parece que es muy larga, pero luego realmente te ciñes al texto y no es para tanto, ¿vale? Espero que os haya ayudado y que no os hayáis sentido abrumados por todo esto, pero es que me gusta mucho la guerra mundial y me gusta mucho poner fotos, que paso tengo una base de datos muy tocha. Muchas gracias por ver el vídeo, ya sabes que eres mi héroe si has llegado hasta aquí y nos vemos en el próximo. Adiós.